At dawn on August 9, 1942, Marines from the 1st Marine Division stood on the beaches of Guadalcanal and watched the last American warships disappear over the horizon. The Navy was leaving, every ship, every destroyer, every transport. They steamed away at maximum speed, abandoning 11,000 Marines on an island the Japanese wanted back. The Marines watched the ships grow smaller. They watched the smoke trails fade into the morning sky. They watched their lifeline to the rest of the war vanish into nothing. The Navy had fought a battle the night before in the waters off Savo Island, the worst United States Navy surface combat defeat in history. 4 heavy cruisers sunk in 32 minutes. HMAS Canberra, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, 1 Australian ship, 3 American. Over 1,000 sailors dead in the dark water. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered all transports and warships to withdraw immediately. Too dangerous to stay. Japanese bombers from Rabaul could arrive any moment. More Japanese warships could return tonight. The risk was too great. The Marines would manage on their own. Marines looked at the supplies stacked on the beaches behind them. Food, ammunition, medical equipment, construction materials. The transports had been unloading for 2 days when the evacuation order came. Less than half of intended supplies made it ashore. 11,000 Marines. 17 days of rations including captured Japanese rice. Only 4 days of ammunition. No heavy equipment. No reserve supplies. No way to get more. Henderson Field was barely operational. The airstrip the Japanese had started building, captured by Marines on August 7th, needed to be finished and defended, and somehow kept running with whatever remained. Because Henderson Field was the only reason Marines were on Guadalcanal. Control the airfield, control the Solomon Islands, control the Solomons, protect the supply line to Australia. Lose Henderson Field, lose the Pacific War. The strategic situation was clear. The tactical situation was simpler. Hold or die. Among the Marines watching the Navy leave were 4 young men from H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, Private First Class Sidney Phillips, 17 years old, when he enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, on December 8, 1941. His friend W.O. Brown, who enlisted with him that same day, in Mobile, Alabama. Jim Young, also from the mortar platoon. Roy Gerlach and Art Pendleton, their squad mates, all assigned to the 81mm mortar platoon, all teenagers, all about to experience 4 months of combat that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and war. Phillips would not turn 18 until September 2nd, during the fighting. The Navy's departure meant these young Marines, and thousands like them, would face the Japanese with whatever ammunition remained and whatever food they could capture or scrounge. Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift commanded the 1st Marine Division. He was 55 years old, born March 13, 1887, in Charlottesville, Virginia. He had served in Nicaragua in 1912 during the capture of Coyotepe. He had served in Haiti starting 1915 during the occupation. He had served in China in 1927 through 1928 as operations and training officer. He knew jungle warfare. He knew guerrilla tactics. He knew counterinsurgency. He knew what happened to isolated garrisons cut off from resupply. On the morning of August 9th, Vandergrift stood at his command post near Lunga Point and received Admiral Turner's message. All naval forces withdrawing. Marines on their own. Vandergrift looked at his operations officer, Colonel Gerald Thomas. Thomas had risen from enlisted Marine in World War I to earn a Silver Star and Battlefield Commission at Belleau Wood. He was the division's architect, the man who translated Vandergrift's strategic vision into tactical reality. Thomas was energetic, outspoken, brilliant. Neither man spoke for a moment as the implications settled. Then Vandergrift gave his orders. Hold the perimeter, finish the airfield, make do with what remains. Thomas moved to the map table and began calculating defensive positions. The Lunga perimeter was roughly 5 miles wide and 2 miles deep. Marines had to defend Henderson Field in the center, beaches on the north, jungle approaches from the south and east. 11,000 men. The Japanese had major forces at Rabaul, 600 miles north. More were coming. The conditions on Guadalcanal were immediately brutal. Japanese bombers from Rabaul hit Henderson Field on August 10th. Marines working to complete the airstrip had no fighter cover. The Navy carriers were gone. Anti-aircraft guns were still being positioned. Bombs fell across the field. Explosions, craters, fires. Marines died filling those craters and repairing that runway. The work never stopped. Sidney Phillips and his mortar platoon were assigned to working parties when not on the line. They filled bomb craters, moved ammunition, cleared fields of fire, established defensive positions. Death was always present. A random bomb during the daily air raids, a sniper round from the jungle, disease. Within days, tropical disease began taking Marines faster than enemy fire. Malaria, dysentery, fungal infections, jungle rot. The Navy's defeat at Savo Island meant medical supplies were critically short. Doctors had atabrine for malaria prevention, little yellow pills that supposedly worked if taken daily. But rumors spread among the Marines that atabrine caused sterility and impotence. Marines spit them out when corpsmen were not watching. Malaria cases became epidemic. By December, over 8,000 men of the 1st Marine Division would have malaria. Tropical diseases disabled nearly 2/3 of the division. Enemy fire accounted for only 1/3 of disabled Marines. The smell of Guadalcanal got into every Marine's nose and stayed there, rotting vegetation in the constant humidity, wet earth that never dried, human waste because proper sanitation facilities could not be built, aviation fuel from Henderson Field, death. The smell of death was everywhere after the first week. The jungle pressed in on the perimeter constantly, dense, dark, endless. At night things moved in there, sometimes Japanese patrols, sometimes wild pigs, sometimes crocodiles in the rivers. Marines learned not to shoot at every sound because ammunition was precious and giving away positions was fatal. They waited in foxholes and listened and tried not to think about what would happen if the Japanese came in force. Marines ate captured Japanese rice mixed with whatever American rations remained. The rice was often infested with maggots and worms. 2 meals per day, 2 tablespoons each, to conserve supplies. Men lost weight rapidly. The heat was suffocating, humidity over 90%. Uniforms rotted on bodies, boots fell apart, equipment rusted. Sid Phillips later recalled that the Marines issued them green cotton twill uniforms. The familiar mottled green camouflage uniforms had not yet been issued. They wore steel helmets and carried either Springfield M1903 rifles or M1917 Enfields. Phillips had been issued Springfield rifle serial number 345293 at Paris Island. He would carry that rifle through Guadalcanal. Vandergrift knew exactly what the Japanese were planning. American codebreakers in Hawaii at Station Hypo had intercepted messages from Rabaul. A regiment was being loaded onto destroyers and fast transports. They would land east of the marine perimeter within days. Their mission was to recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans off Guadalcanal. Japanese commanders believed there were only about 2,000 Marines on the island. They were wrong by a factor of 5, but confident this force would be sufficient. On August 18th, Vandergrift called a meeting of his battalion commanders. He spread a map on his field table and explained the situation. The Japanese were coming, probably from the east, probably soon. Marines had to hold. No fallback position, no evacuation plan, no reinforcements coming. Hold the perimeter, hold the airfield. That was the entire mission. One commander asked what would happen if the line broke. Vandergrift looked at him and said, "Then we all die here." The meeting ended. The commanders returned to their units and told their men to dig deeper foxholes. The night of August 20th, a Solomon Islander named Martin Clemens brought intelligence to Vandergrift's command post. Clemens was a British colonial administrator, a district officer who had stayed behind when the Japanese occupied Guadalcanal. He was part of the Coast Watcher network, brave men who hid in the jungle and radioed Japanese movements to the Australians who relayed information to Americans. Clemens knew the island intimately. He had been watching Japanese movements for weeks. Japanese forces had landed at Taivu Point, 20 miles east of the perimeter. Estimated strength, 900 to 1,000 men. They were preparing to move west toward Henderson Field. Vandergrift asked how long until the Japanese attacked. Clemens said maybe 24 hours, maybe less. They would come at night. The Japanese always attacked at night. Vandergrift ordered the eastern defences strengthened immediately. Colonel Clifton Cates commanded the 1st Marine Regiment. He was a World War I veteran, with a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars from Belleau Wood and Soissons. He was 49 years old, tough, experienced, demanding. He deployed his 1st Battalion along a river the Marines called Alligator Creek, actually the Elu River, misidentified on American maps, but the name stuck. Alligator Creek formed the eastern boundary of the Lunga perimeter. A sandbar about 7 to 15 meters wide connected the west bank to the ocean. That sandbar was where the Japanese would have to cross to reach Henderson Field. Cates positioned machine guns on the west bank, Browning M 1917, water-cooled 30 caliber machine guns, aimed at the sandbar. Riflemen dug in behind them. Artillery from the 11th Marines registered targets on the far side of the creek. The Marines were ready. They waited. At 1:30 on the morning of August 21st, machine gun fire erupted on the eastern perimeter, Japanese voices screaming, American voices shouting orders, the hammering of machine guns, the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of grenades. Private First Class Sidney Phillips was with his mortar platoon 400 yards from the sandbar. He could hear the battle but could not see it in the darkness. The noise was continuous. Screaming, shooting, explosions. It went on for hours. Phillips and his squad waited for orders. They stayed at their gun, ready to fire if called. The orders never came. The machine guns at the sandbar were doing the work. At dawn, Marines moved forward to assess the damage. What they found was slaughter on a scale few had witnessed. Bodies, hundreds of them, Japanese soldiers dead on the sandbar, in the water, piled along the creek bank. Marines had cut them down as they tried to cross. Machine gun fire at close range, canister rounds from artillery, grenades thrown from 10 feet away. The Japanese had charged straight into prepared positions and been annihilated. During the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, came to Phillips' mortar position. Pollock was a tough veteran who led from the front. He saw Phillips's 81mm mortar and asked who the gunner was. Phillips raised his hand. Pollock said, "Well, boy, use me as the range stakes." He ran out about 40 feet in front of the gun and held his hand up. Phillips put the sights on 0 deflection, and they dragged the gun so that they had Pollock lined up. Phillips noticed beyond Pollock through the trees was an abandoned American amphibious tank on the enemy side of the river. The Japanese had gotten a machine gun into that vehicle and were firing from inside it. Pollock said to try 300 yards. Phillips fired. The shot was right on, but a little beyond the target. They adjusted. The next round hit the amphibious tank. The machine gun stopped firing. Pollock nodded and moved on to direct other positions. Later that morning, General Vandergrift and his staff came up right behind the mortar positions. Vandergrift was the commanding general, the top officer on Guadalcanal. He was within 10 feet of Phillips's gun. A corporal followed behind Vandergrift with a 12-gauge pump shotgun at port arms. The corporal's only job was to guard the general. Phillips' buddy Ransom whispered, "Phillips, if you want to get your ass kicked, just go over there and stand between the general and that corporal." Around 10 o'clock in the morning, American tanks arrived. M3 Stuart light tanks from A Company, 1st Tank Battalion. They came down the beach single file. Phillips could have reached out and touched them as they passed. The tanks crossed the sandbar and scattered out in the coconut grove on the other side, maybe 200 yards away. Marines could see them dashing around the grove. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion had circled around from the south during the night. They came around and drove surviving Japanese ahead of them out into the ocean. Marines on the beach shot them as they tried to swim away. By noon, the battle was over. Out of 917 men in the Ichiki Regiment's 1st Element, fewer than 30 escaped. The rest died at Alligator Creek or on the sandbar trying to reach American positions. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, the Japanese commander, died in the battle. Some accounts say he was killed advancing toward American lines. Others say he committed ritual suicide after burning his regimental flag to prevent its capture. Either way, the Ichiki Regiment ceased to exist as a fighting force. Phillips and other Marines walked through the battlefield afterward, bodies everywhere. The ground torn up by machine gun fire, artillery, tank tracks, blood, flies, the smell. Phillips had never seen anything like it. Nobody had. But it changed something fundamental. For months, Japanese forces had been winning everywhere. Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. The Japanese army seemed invincible. Superior fighting spirit, superior jungle tactics, superior night fighting. American propaganda acknowledged it. Training manuals emphasized it. The Japanese were better soldiers. That was the assumption drilled into every Marine during training. Alligator Creek proved it wrong. 11,000 Marines, abandoned by the Navy, low on supplies and ammunition, dug into defensive positions and destroyed a crack Japanese regiment in a few hours. The Japanese had attacked with absolute confidence and been slaughtered. Word of the victory spread through the perimeter. Men who had been watching the horizon, expecting Japanese reinforcements and their own deaths, started believing they might survive. Maybe they could hold Henderson Field. Maybe planes would come. Maybe the Navy would return. Maybe. The problem was the Japanese had the same realization. If 900 men could not take Henderson Field, send more. Send thousands more. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi commanded the 35th Infantry Brigade. He was a veteran officer with extensive combat experience in China and the Dutch East Indies. He had studied American tactics at staff colleges. He knew Americans relied on firepower and defensive positions. He planned an attack that would avoid American strengths and exploit weaknesses. 3 coordinated assaults from different directions. One from the east along the coast, one from the south through the jungle, one from the west across the Matanikau River. The main effort would come from the south, through terrain the Americans thought was impenetrable. Dense jungle, steep ravines, no trails. Kawaguchi's men would march through that jungle carrying their weapons and equipment, approach Henderson Field from the rear, and attack at night when American firepower was less effective. The plan was tactically sound. It almost worked. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson commanded the 1st Raider Battalion. Edson was 45 years old, born April 25, 1897. They called him Red Mike because of his red hair. He had fought Sandino's guerrillas in Nicaragua in the 1920s and 1930s. He knew guerrilla warfare intimately. He knew night fighting. He knew ambush tactics and jungle warfare better than most American officers. He had earned 2 Navy Crosses in Nicaragua for actions under fire. On September 9th, Edson stood on a ridge south of Henderson Field, studying the terrain with field glasses. Colonel Gerald Thomas, Vandergrift's operations officer, stood with him. Edson pointed to the ridge. If the Japanese attack from the south, they will come through here. This ridge is the only high ground between the jungle and the airfield. If they take this ridge, they can bring artillery forward and destroy Henderson Field from 1,200 yards away. We lose the ridge. We lose the airfield. We lose the airfield. We lose Guadalcanal. We lose Guadalcanal. We lose the Solomon Islands. The whole campaign collapses. Thomas asked what Edson needed. Edson said, "Give me my Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, about 840 men total. Let me defend this ridge. I guarantee the Japanese will not get past us." Thomas took the request to Vandergrift. Vandergrift trusted Edson's instincts completely. He approved immediately. On September 11th, Edson's Raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion moved onto the ridge. The Raiders had already fought on Tulagi. They were tough, experienced, well-led. The parachutists were elite troops, volunteers who had gone through extra training. Together they were the best infantry on Guadalcanal. They dug foxholes along the ridge. They positioned machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. They registered artillery targets with the 11th Marines. Forward observers plotted coordinates for every approach. They cleared fields of fire, cutting down vegetation that might provide cover for attackers. They strung what little barbed wire they had. They prepared defensive positions in depth, primary positions with fallback lines. They cached ammunition and grenades at key points. Then they waited. On the night of September 12th, the battle started. Artillery fire first. Japanese mortars and howitzers dropping shells on the ridge. The bombardment was brief but intense. Then rifle fire from the jungle below. Then, screaming, Japanese soldiers charging up the ridge in waves, yelling battle cries. Edson's Marines firing from foxholes, Springfields and Enfields, and machine guns hammering, cutting the attackers down. The Japanese kept coming. When one wave died, another formed and charged. Marines fell back to secondary positions as ordered, firing as they moved, then held the new line. The Japanese came again. Artillery fire from the 11th Marines was critical. Forward observers called in coordinates. American shells landed close, sometimes dangerously close, to Marine positions, 20 yards in front of the foxholes. The concussion was terrifying, but the shells were killing Japanese soldiers massed for attacks. Some positions had hand-to-hand fighting, Marines and Japanese soldiers bayoneting each other in complete darkness, grenades thrown back and forth. The sound was constant. Rifle fire, machine gun fire, explosions, screaming in English and Japanese. Edson moved among his positions throughout the night. He stood on top of a grenade box giving orders while bullets snapped past his head. He refused to get down. His Marines saw him standing there under fire and held their positions. If the colonel could stand in the open, they could fight from their foxholes. The Japanese attacks continued through the night. At dawn on September 13th, there was a brief lull. Wounded were evacuated. Ammunition was redistributed. The dead were left where they fell. There was no time for burial. That night, the Japanese came again. Heavier attacks, better coordinated. They reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post. Marines formed a final defensive line. This was it. If this line broke, the Japanese would be through. Henderson Field would be an artillery range. The airfield would be destroyed. Marines loaded weapons and waited. The Japanese charged. Marines fired everything they had. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, artillery. The noise was beyond description. Individual shots merged into continuous roar. Japanese soldiers died in piles in front of Marine positions, but more kept coming. Some broke through. Marines fought them hand-to-hand in foxholes. Bayonets, knives, entrenching tools, rifle butts, fists, anything. In one position, a Marine ran out of ammunition and beat a Japanese soldier to death with his helmet. The fighting was primeval, savage, desperate, but the line held. At dawn on September 14th, the Japanese attacks stopped. Kawaguchi had lost over 600 confirmed, killed with hundreds more wounded dying in the jungle. His brigade was shattered. The survivors retreated west to regroup. Edson's forces had lost 57 killed, 40 from the Raider Battalion, 17 from the Parachute Battalion, 232 wounded. They held the ridge. Henderson Field was safe. Marines started calling it Bloody Ridge. Others called it Edson's Ridge. Either name worked. The smell was worse than anything at Alligator Creek. Bodies had been lying in tropical heat for 2 days. Flies were thick. The ridge was torn apart. Every tree shredded by bullets. The ground covered in shell craters, spent cartridges, blood, pieces of equipment, unexploded grenades. Marines sat in their foxholes too exhausted to move. Some cried. Some laughed from relief or hysteria or shock. Most stared at nothing. What Marines did not know was that their success on Guadalcanal had changed Japanese strategy across the entire Pacific. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese 17th Army headquartered at Rabaul. He had been planning a major offensive in New Guinea to capture Port Moresby and threaten Australia directly. That offensive required troops, supplies, air support, naval support. Everything was in place. Japanese forces were within 30 miles of Port Moresby. Then Kawaguchi's defeat at Bloody Ridge arrived in reports to Rabaul. Hyakutake read the casualty figures. He read the tactical analysis. He understood what it meant. The Americans on Guadalcanal were not collapsing. They were getting stronger. Henderson Field was operational. American planes were flying from the airfield every day, attacking Japanese ships, bombing Japanese positions on Guadalcanal, intercepting Japanese aircraft. As long as Henderson Field existed, Japanese could not control the Solomons. As long as Japanese did not control the Solomons, they could not secure their southern flank. As long as their southern flank was insecure, They could not advance further anywhere. Imperial General Headquarters agreed with Hyakutake's assessment. Suspend the New Guinea offensive. Send everything to Guadalcanal. Retake Henderson Field. Destroy the American Marines. That became the absolute priority. Japanese troops within 30 miles of Port Moresby received orders to withdraw on September 15th. They would never get that close again. The decision to prioritize Guadalcanal over New Guinea fundamentally altered the Pacific War's strategic direction. The Japanese Navy responded by increasing attacks on Henderson Field. Warships approached at night and shelled the airfield with 8-inch guns from cruisers and 14-inch guns from battleships. The bombardments destroyed planes, cratered runways, set fuel dumps on fire, killed Marines in their sleep. The worst bombardment came on the night of October 14th. 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, both Kongo-class battleships with 14-inch main batteries, steamed into position north of Guadalcanal. They opened fire at Henderson Field from 12,000 yards at approximately 1:30 in the morning. They fired for 83 minutes. 973 14-inch shells. Each shell weighed 1,500 pounds. The Marines had no name for it, except the bombardment. Always capitalized, always spoken with dread. The sound was beyond description, not like artillery which Marines knew. This was like the earth itself being torn apart. The ground shook with each impact. Dirt and debris rained from the sky. Trees burst into flame. The blast waves from shells landing hundreds of yards away knocked men down in their foxholes. Marines pressed themselves to the bottoms of their holes and prayed. Some screamed but could not be heard over the impacts. Some lost their minds temporarily, curled into balls unable to move. When dawn came, Henderson Field was a moonscape. Craters everywhere, some 15 feet deep. 48 planes destroyed out of 90 total. Fuel supplies burning, sending black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Ammunition dumps had exploded during the bombardment. The runway was so damaged it looked unusable, cratered and torn. Pierced steel planking twisted and scattered. But Marines fixed it. Engineers from the 1st Pioneer Battalion worked through the morning despite exhaustion and fear. They filled craters with coral and dirt. They leveled surfaces. They patched the runway with pierced steel planking salvaged from damaged sections and supply dumps. They worked under threat of Japanese air attack because the Japanese bombers came every day. By noon, planes could take off if they were careful. By evening, planes could land. Henderson Field was operational again. The Japanese could not believe it. They had thrown the heaviest naval bombardment of the campaign at that airfield. 14-inch shells from battleships. And still the Americans kept flying. The air crews operating from Henderson Field became known as the Cactus Air Force. After Cactus, the American code name for Guadalcanal, they flew whatever planes they had. Grumman F-4F Wildcats for fighter cover. Douglas SBD. Dauntless dive bombers for attacking ships and ground targets. A few Army P-400 Aerocobras. Most planes were shot up, patched together with parts scavenged from wrecks, barely airworthy. Fuel was so scarce they siphoned it from destroyed aircraft. Spare parts came from other damaged planes. Mechanics worked around the clock, keeping planes flying. Nothing was wasted. Pilots flew missions until they collapsed from exhaustion, malaria, dysentery, or combat fatigue. Then they slept for a few hours and climbed back in the cockpit and flew again. Every Marine on Guadalcanal understood the equation clearly. Keep Henderson Field running. Stay alive. Lose Henderson Field. Die. Simple as that. So they worked through daily air raids and nightly naval bombardments and constant dysentery and malaria and fear that never left. They kept the airfield operational. They kept fighting. On October 23rd, the Japanese launched their largest ground offensive of the campaign. Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal from Rabaul to personally command the attack. He brought approximately 20,000 troops. Not 30,000, as some estimates claimed, but 20,000 was still the largest force yet committed. Artillery, tanks, the 2nd Division, elements of the 38th Division. This was not a regimental attack like Ichiki. This was not a brigade like Kawaguchi. This was a multi-division assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Hyakutake told his officers that Henderson Field would fall within 3 days. Then the Marines would be destroyed. Then Guadalcanal would be Japanese again. The offensive began on October 23rd and lasted 4 days and nights. The Japanese attacked from the east, Marines held. The Japanese attacked from the south toward the same ridge Edson had defended, Marines held. The Japanese attacked from the west across the Matanikau River, Marines held. Artillery fire, mortar fire, machine gun fire, rifle fire, hand-to-hand combat in some positions. Marines gave ground in places, then counterattacked and took it back. The Japanese reached within yards of the airfield runway in one western sector. Marine artillery fired at point-blank range, gun crews loading and firing as fast as they could work, sometimes firing over open sights at Japanese infantry in the open. The Japanese attack broke. Survivors retreated back into the jungle. By October 26th, Hyakutake's offensive had failed completely. He lost approximately 2,200 to 3,000 men killed, thousands more wounded, many of whom would die in the jungle from lack of medical care. His attacking force was combat ineffective. American casualties were heavy too, hundreds killed, over 1,000 wounded. But the Marines held. Henderson Field was still American. Sid Phillips and H Company had been in reserve during parts of the October offensive, but saw action at various points. Japanese troops regrouped west of the Matanikau River and dug defensive positions. They were no longer trying to retake the island. They were trying to survive long enough to be evacuated. Food supplies were exhausted. They were starving. Disease was rampant. Marines walked through battlefields south and west of the airfield on October 27th. The carnage was beyond anything witnessed at Alligator Creek or Bloody Ridge. Bodies, Japanese and American, lay everywhere in various states of decomposition. Equipment scattered across the ground. Helmets, rifles, packs, boots, canteens, ammunition. The smell made men vomit. Marines, hardened by months of combat, stood and vomited from the smell. Nobody talked much. What was there to say? They had won. They were still on Guadalcanal. They were still alive. That was enough. The victory in late October marked the strategic turning point. The Japanese Navy made one final attempt to bombard Henderson Field and land major reinforcements in mid-November. The naval battle of Guadalcanal lasted 3 days from November 12th through 15th, 1942. American ships and Japanese ships fought at close range in the waters off Guadalcanal and around Savo Island, where the campaign had begun with disaster in August. Both sides lost heavily in brutal night surface actions. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers, USS Atlanta and USS Juneau, and 7 destroyers sunk. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, 1 heavy cruiser Kinugasa, and 3 destroyers sunk. More importantly, for the campaign's outcome, the Japanese lost a transport convoy carrying 7,000 reinforcements and critical supplies. American planes from Henderson Field, the Cactus Air Force that refused to die, sank most of the transports before they could unload. The few transports that did reach shore were forced to unload in daylight under continuous air attack. Most supplies were destroyed before they could be moved inland. The troops who did make it ashore were starving within days because no food had been successfully landed. By late November, the Japanese position on Guadalcanal was hopeless. They could not reinforce. They could not resupply. They could not evacuate during daylight because of American air superiority from Henderson Field. The field they had tried so hard to capture or destroy now controlled the seas and skies around Guadalcanal. The Japanese tried using submarines to bring in supplies. It was not nearly enough. They tried using fast destroyers in night runs called the Tokyo Express or Rat Run. American PT boats and aircraft from Henderson Field attacked them. Some supplies got through, but nowhere near enough. Japanese soldiers were reduced to eating grass and roots. Thousands died from starvation and disease. On December 9th, 1942, Major General Vandergrift and the 1st Marine Division were officially relieved by fresh American forces. The Army's American Division and the 2nd Marine Division took over the lines. Vandergrift's Marines had been on Guadalcanal for 4 months and 2 days. They landed 11,000 strong on August 7th. Approximately 7,000 remained combat effective on December 9th. The rest were casualties or had been evacuated, sick with malaria, dysentery, or severe combat fatigue. Sid Phillips and H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines left Guadalcanal on December 22nd. They boarded transport ships at Lunga Point and watched the island disappear behind them. Most weighed 30 to 40 pounds less than when they landed. Phillips had lost significant weight from his already lean frame. Most had malaria, most had dysentery, most had seen close friends die. Phillips carried Springfield rifle serial number 345293 off Guadalcanal, the same rifle issued to him at Paris Island. The 1st Marine Regiment sailed to Melbourne, Australia for rest, recovery, and training for the next operation. The Army and Marines who replaced Vandergrift's division continued the Guadalcanal campaign until February 7, 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated under cover of darkness in a brilliantly executed withdrawal operation. American forces found empty positions and abandoned equipment the next morning. Approximately 14,800 Japanese soldiers had died in combat on Guadalcanal. Another 9,000 to 10,000 died from disease and starvation, most in the final months. The Japanese successfully evacuated approximately 10,000 survivors, most of them sick, wounded, or severely malnourished. American casualties totaled approximately 1,500, 92 killed in action, and 4,183 wounded in action. Total casualties, including disease, approached 7,000. The 6-month campaign had been the first sustained ground offensive against Japanese forces in the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake survived the campaign. He returned to Rabaul and continued to command the 17th Army for the remainder of the war, but he never again attempted a major offensive operation. The defeat at Guadalcanal broke the momentum of Japanese expansion permanently. Before Guadalcanal, Japan was advancing on all fronts. After Guadalcanal, Japan was in strategic retreat across the Pacific. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, who led the 35th Brigade attack at Bloody Ridge, was relieved of command in late October 1942 after his defeat became clear. He spent the rest of the war in administrative staff positions. He survived and returned to Japan after surrender, but his military reputation was destroyed. He was later convicted of war crimes committed in the Philippines during earlier operations and served prison time. Colonel Merritt Edson, who defended the ridge that bears his name, received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his outstanding and heroic conduct, his inspiring leadership, his personal courage against overwhelming odds. President Roosevelt presented the award on May 21, 1943, in a ceremony at the White House. Edson continued to command the 1st Raider Battalion through the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. He later commanded other Marine units in subsequent Pacific operations. He was promoted through the ranks and retired as a Major General on August 1, 1947. He struggled with post-traumatic stress in his final years. He died by suicide using carbon monoxide on August 14, 1955, at age 58. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift received the Medal of Honor for his command of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. President Franklin Roosevelt presented the award on February 5, 1943. The citation noted Vandergrift's tenacity, courage, and resourcefulness against a strong, determined, and experienced enemy. It praised his ability to command eventually including sea, land, and air forces from Army, Navy, and Marine Corps in a joint operation. He was promoted to Lieutenant General and commanded the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps at Bougainville in November 1943. On January 1, 1944, Vandergrift became the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps. On March 21, 1945, he was promoted to 4-star General, the first Marine Corps officer to hold that rank while on active duty. He served as Commandant until January 1, 1948, guiding the Marine Corps through the end of World War II, demobilization, and the difficult post-war period when the Marine Corps fought for its institutional survival. He retired on April 1, 1949, and died on May 8, 1973, at age 86. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Colonel Clifton Cates, who commanded the 1st Marines and whose troops stopped the Ichiki Regiment at Alligator Creek, went on to command the 4th Marine Division at Tinian in 1944. Tinian is considered by many military historians as the model amphibious operation of World War II nearly perfectly executed. Cates later served as the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps from January 1948 to January 1952. He retired as a 4-star general. Colonel Gerald Thomas, the operations officer who was the architect of Guadalcanal's defensive success and Vandergrift's closest tactical advisor, accompanied Vandergrift to Washington after Guadalcanal. He served as Director of Plans and Policies at Marine Corps Headquarters, essentially functioning as Chief of Staff. Thomas later commanded the 1st Marine Division in Korea during some of the heaviest fighting of that war. He retired as a 4-star general. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Twining, who served as Thomas's deputy operations officer and was known for his aggressive, outspoken style, also rose through the ranks. The 4 senior officers, Vandergrift, Thomas, Edson, and Twining, became known as the Guadalcanal Mafia for the bonds they formed on the island and their subsequent rise through Marine Corps leadership. All 4 retired as generals. Their professional and personal relationships forged at Guadalcanal shaped Marine Corps doctrine and leadership for decades. Private First Class Sidney Phillips returned to the United States eventually after completing his service. While at Cape Gloucester on New Britain Island in late 1943, Phillips decided he wanted to become a physician. After his 4-year Marine Corps enlistment expired on December 31, 1945, he returned to Mobile. He used the GI Bill to attend Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. He then went to medical school and became a family physician, practicing in Mobile for over 40 years. In April 1946, he married Mary Victoria Houston at a ceremony in Mobile. His childhood friend, Eugene Sledge, who had gone on to become a Marine and fought in some of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles at Peleliu and Okinawa, served as best man at the wedding. The friendship between Phillips and Sledge that began in childhood, Mobile endured through war and lasted their entire lives. Phillips practiced family medicine in Mobile for decades, serving the community where he grew up. In 1997, he began writing a memoir for his family, an accounting of his experiences as a Guadalcanal Marine. He titled it, "You'll Be Sorry," the phonetic spelling of what Marine drill instructors told recruits constantly during training. "You'll be sorry you joined." The memoir was published in 2010 by Valor Studios. Phillips' memoir provided valuable first-hand accounts of combat at the small unit level, the kind of detail that official histories often miss. His recollections of specific battles, daily life under fire, the fear and exhaustion and determination of young Marines fighting their first campaign became an important primary source for historians. He was featured in Ken Burns' 7-part PBS documentary series, The War in 2007, where he provided oral history interviews about the Guadalcanal campaign. He was portrayed by actor Ashton Holmes in the HBO miniseries The Pacific in 2010. Phillips served as a historical consultant for the series, working with the production team to ensure accuracy in depicting the realities of Marine combat in the Pacific theater. Mary Phillips died in April 2000. Sidney Phillips died on September 26, 2015, at age 91, in Mobile, Alabama, the city where he was born, where he enlisted, where he practiced medicine, where he raised his family. He was buried next to his wife. The decision to withdraw the Navy from Guadalcanal after the Battle of Savo Island remains controversial among military historians. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner believed staying would have meant losing more ships, possibly all the remaining ships in the task force, and that would have doomed the entire South Pacific campaign. He calculated it was better to sacrifice supplies and leave Marines temporarily unsupported than lose the fleet entirely. The Marines saw it differently. They saw ships sailing away while they stayed behind with 17 days of food and only 4 days of ammunition. Some Marines called it abandonment, some called it betrayal. Most simply called it the situation and dealt with it, as Marines always deal with impossible situations. They adapted, they improvised, they survived. Historians continue to debate whether Turner made the correct strategic decision. The Navy would return in force within weeks. Supply runs by destroyer began in late August. The crisis passed. But for those Marines standing on the beach on August 9th watching the ships disappear, none of that was certain. What is not debatable among historians is what happened after the Navy left. The Marines held. They held through Japanese attacks and naval bombardments and starvation and disease. They held when conventional military wisdom said they should have been overrun within weeks. They held because they had no other choice. No fallback position existed. No evacuation was possible. Hold or die. They chose to hold. That choice changed the Pacific War's strategic trajectory. If the Marines had been driven off Guadalcanal in August or September or October 1942, the Japanese would have controlled the southern Solomon Islands permanently. They could have established major air and naval bases there. They could have directly threatened Australia's security. They could have disrupted Allied supply lines across the South Pacific. They could have consolidated positions that would have required years and enormous casualties to recapture. Instead, the Marines held Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force flew from that field daily despite impossible conditions. American ships eventually used the field for air cover. The Solomons became an American base instead of a Japanese stronghold. The road to Rabaul and the Philippines and eventually Japan itself went through Guadalcanal, and it all started with 11,000 Marines standing on a beach watching the Navy leave and deciding to stay anyway and hold that airfield no matter what came. The monument to the 1st Marine Division stands on Guadalcanal today, near where Henderson Field used to be. The field is now Honiara International Airport, officially renamed in September 2003. It remains the primary international airport for the Solomon Islands. The monument is simple black stone with names engraved. Over 1,000 names of Marines who died on Guadalcanal between August and December 1942. The names appear in division muster rolls, in unit citations, in Medal of Honor recommendations, in casualty reports, in the historical record of men who were there when the Navy left and stayed anyway, and held until relief came. That is how history actually happens in war, not through perfect plans or overwhelming force, but through young Marines like Sidney Phillips and his squadmates, holding a perimeter with 17 days of rations and 4 days of ammunition, eating wormy rice, dying from malaria and dysentery, fighting off Japanese attacks night after night, and deciding that giving up was simply not an option, no matter how bad things got. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.